The Town Where Nobody Could Die, Part 1. The Arrival. The fog came first, rolling down from the mountains like a living thing with intention and appetite, thick enough to drown the valley in a gray absence that wasn't quite darkness and wasn't quite light, but something in between. A liminal state where visibility ended 10 feet ahead and the world beyond that threshold ceased to exist in any meaningful way, where sound traveled wrong and distance became negotiable, and the basic reliability of physical space revealed itself as just another comfortable lie people told themselves to maintain the illusion of control over their environment. Ethan Hale drove through that fog for 20 minutes before the first buildings emerged from the gray-like photographs developing in chemical solution, materializing gradually from pure potential into definite form, from possibility into actuality, from the realm of things that might be into the concrete reality of things that were. Greywick sat in the valley's lowest point, cupped by steep forested slopes on three sides and opening toward the west, where a river had carved through the mountains millennia ago to create the single narrow passage that connected this isolated pocket of human habitation to the broader world beyond. The town looked exactly like the photographs Ethan had studied during his research. Small, orderly, unremarkable in every way, except for the single statistical anomaly that had brought him here, that had transformed Greywick from just another fading rural community into the subject of his investigation, into a mystery that demanded explanation despite every rational instinct insisting that explanations wouldn't be found because the premise itself was impossible. 53 years without a single death. Not one, not from cancer or heart disease or car accidents or any of the 1,000 other ways human bodies failed and human lives ended. Not from old age, not from violence, not from the random catastrophes that struck without pattern or mercy and reminded people that mortality wasn't theoretical but immediate, wasn't distant but always present, wasn't something that happened to other people, but the universal destiny that awaited everyone, regardless of wealth or virtue, or the desperate hope that somehow they might be the exception to rules that had never admitted exceptions in all of human history. The hospital records were public. Ethan had verified them through 3 independent sources before accepting that the data was accurate rather than clerical error or conspiracy or elaborate hoax. 0 deaths, 0 obituaries in the local newspaper, 0 new graves in the cemetery that sat on the hill overlooking Main Street. The population had remained exactly 347 for 53 years, despite no births being recorded either. Despite the logical impossibility of a community maintaining perfect numerical stability for more than 5 decades, despite every principle of demographics and statistics and common sense screaming that this couldn't be real. But it was real, and Ethan intended to discover why. He parked his car in front of the diner, a squat brick building with large windows that should have been filled with the warm glow of interior lights and the movement of people eating and talking and performing all the ordinary rituals of small-town life. But the windows were dark, despite the sign on the door claiming the establishment was open, despite several cars in the parking lot suggesting customers inside, despite every indication that business was being conducted beyond the glass that somehow failed to transmit any light from interior to exterior, that seemed to absorb illumination rather than allow it to pass through normally. The silence was wrong, not peaceful or restful or the comfortable quiet of a town far from highways and airports and all the acoustic pollution of modern civilization. This silence felt heavy, felt pressed down from above like atmospheric pressure before a storm, felt like something was actively suppressing sound rather than sound simply being absent because nothing was making noise. Ethan could hear his own footsteps with unnatural clarity, could hear his breathing echo slightly off the buildings that lined Main Street, could hear the blood moving through his ears with the kind of internal acoustic awareness that usually only came in completely soundproofed environments where external noise had been eliminated so thoroughly that the body's own processes became audible. He pushed open the diner's door, expecting the normal bell or chime to announce his entrance. No bell rang. The door opened silently, despite the mechanical bell clearly mounted above it, despite the clapper that should have struck metal and produced the familiar bright sound that marked transitions between outside and inside, between street and establishment, between being alone and being among other people. The bell was there, the mechanism intact, but it made no sound when he entered, made no announcement of his presence, allowed him to step into the diner unheralded and unnoticed by the people who sat at tables and booths with coffee cups and plates of food arranged before them in tableaus that looked perfect, that looked exactly like what a diner scene should look like, that looked so precisely correct they seemed almost staged. The people didn't look up when he entered, didn't acknowledge his presence with the small social gestures that normally marked someone new entering, no glances, no brief pauses in conversation, no subtle adjustments of posture that indicated awareness of changed conditions. They continued whatever they were doing with the exact same intensity and focus they'd presumably been applying before he arrived, as if his entrance had registered nowhere in their perception, as if he'd stepped not into their space, but into some parallel version of their space, where his presence created no disturbance, no ripples, no evidence that he existed in the same reality they occupied. Ethan approached the counter, where a waitress stood motionless with a coffee pot in her hand, her body positioned as if she'd been pouring, but the pot held at an angle that would have sent liquid cascading over the cup's rim if any coffee were actually flowing from the spout. But nothing poured. She stood frozen in the gesture of pouring, without any liquid moving, without any progression from intention to action, caught in the liminal space between beginning a task and completing it. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice sounding too loud in the oppressive quiet, sounding almost aggressive despite his intention to speak normally, to make simple contact, to initiate the basic social transaction of ordering coffee and beginning conversation that might lead to information. The waitress blinked, not in response to his words. The blink came half a second too late for that, came with the timing of something programmed rather than reactive, came with a delay that suggested she'd needed that fraction of a second to process his presence and determine how to respond, rather than responding with the immediate automaticity of normal human social reflexes. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice pleasant but flat, carrying no emotional coloring, no warmth or curiosity or any of the subtle tones that usually accompanied speech, that made communication more than just information exchange, that transformed words into human connection. "Please," Ethan said, settling onto a stool at the counter. "And information, if you have it." "Information?" The word came out with the same effectless tone, the same lack of inflection that made it impossible to tell if she was asking a question or simply repeating what he'd said. "About the town, about Greywick. I'm a journalist. I'm researching the unusual longevity of your residents, the fact that no one here has died in over 50 years. The waitress poured coffee into a cup that had materialized on the counter without Ethan noticing her place it there, without any transition between the counter being empty and the cup being present. She poured with mechanical precision, filling the cup to exactly 3/4 full before tilting the pot back to vertical and setting it on the warming plate behind her. No spills, no drips. Perfect execution of a task she'd presumably performed thousands of times before. "People don't die in Greywick," she said simply, as if reporting the weather or the daily special, as if stating a fact so mundane and self-evident it required no elaboration or explanation. "But that's impossible," Ethan pressed. "People die everywhere. It's the one universal constant. Human bodies fail. Accidents happen. Disease progresses. Death is inevitable." The waitress looked at him with eyes that seemed slightly unfocused, seemed to be looking at him and through him simultaneously, seemed to be registering his physical presence while failing to quite see him as an individual person rather than just another object occupying space in the diner. "Inevitable," she repeated, and something in how she said the word suggested she was tasting it, testing it, trying to remember what it meant or why it should matter. "Not here. Not anymore." Before Ethan could ask what she meant by any more, before he could pursue that thread of information that suggested things had been different once, had changed at some definable point in the past, the door opened behind him and someone entered with footsteps that were audible, that created normal sounds of boots on linoleum, that produced acoustic evidence of movement and weight and physical presence in ways that felt almost shocking after the pervasive silence that had greeted Ethan's own arrival. He turned to see a man in his 60s, weather-worn face, work clothes, carrying pruning shears and wearing heavy gloves, entering the diner with the casual familiarity of someone who'd walked through that door 1,000 times before and expected no surprises beyond those doors. The man nodded to several people at tables who didn't nod back, didn't acknowledge him, didn't interrupt their frozen tableaus to perform even the most minimal social recognition of his presence. "Harold," the waitress called out, still in that same flat tone. "You want the usual?" "Not today, Margie," Harold replied, his voice carrying actual emotion, actual human warmth and casualness, and the small variations of pitch and tone that marked natural speech. "Just came in to use the bathroom. Been working on the hedges at the Henderson place all morning." He moved toward the back of the diner, where presumably bathrooms were located, walked past Ethan with the easy indifference of someone who had no reason to notice strangers because strangers so rarely appeared in Greywick that the category of stranger had become theoretical rather than something requiring actual social navigation. Ethan turned back to his coffee and found that the liquid had gone cold, despite having been poured less than a minute ago. Despite steam still rising from its surface in visible curls that contradicted the temperature his mouth registered when he tried to take a sip. The coffee was simultaneously hot and cold, simultaneously fresh and stale, simultaneously existing in multiple states that should have been mutually exclusive, but apparently weren't, because normal physics had clearly become negotiable in Greywick, had transformed from universal laws into local suggestions that could be accepted or ignored depending on circumstances. Ethan didn't yet understand. The sound came from outside, a short, sharp cry of pain followed by a crash and the metallic ringing of something striking iron fence posts. Ethan was off his stool and moving toward the door before conscious thought caught up with instinct, before his brain finished processing what his body had already recognized as distress call, requiring immediate response. He burst through the door onto the sidewalk and saw Harold lying on the ground beside a tall iron fence, one of the decorative spikes that topped the fence's posts, driven through his thigh with terrible precision, with the kind of penetrating injury that should have been immediately fatal or close enough to fatal, that survival would require immediate trauma surgery and massive blood transfusions. Blood pooled beneath Harold's leg, spreading across the sidewalk in a dark stain that looked black in the strange diffuse light filtering through Greywick's perpetual fog. The spike had penetrated completely through muscle and possibly bone, had created a wound that no amount of first aid could address, that required professional intervention within minutes, or Harold would bleed out right there on the sidewalk while Ethan watched and failed to save him because he had no training, no equipment, no capacity to address trauma this severe. Ethan's hands were on his phone, dialing emergency services before he consciously decided to call, before his rational mind caught up with the automatic response his body had initiated. But before the call could connect, before he could report the accident and location and urgent need for ambulance, Harold spoke. "Well, that's goddamn inconvenient," Harold said, his voice carrying irritation rather than pain, expressing frustration rather than terror, complaining about the situation as if it were a minor setback rather than a potentially fatal injury. Ethan stared, phone forgotten. "Sir, don't move. You've been impaled. We need to get you medical attention immediately." "It'll pass," Harold said, gripping the spike with both hands. "Always does." And then he pulled. The spike slid free of his leg with a wet sound that made Ethan's stomach lurch, made his vision gray at the edges, made every evolutionary instinct for empathy and shared pain light up in his nervous system as he watched Harold extract several inches of iron from his own flesh with no more concern than someone removing a splinter. Blood gushed from the wound, spurted with each heartbeat in rhythmic pulses that should have been Harold's life draining away onto the sidewalk, should have been the beginning of hemorrhagic shock that would progress to unconsciousness and death within minutes. But the blood stopped, not gradually, not with the slow clotting that normal physiology produced when wounds began to heal, but immediately, as if someone had turned off a faucet, as if the flow of blood wasn't governed by cardiovascular pressure and damaged vessels, but by some other mechanism that could be switched from on to off with binary simplicity. And then the wound began to close. Ethan watched, couldn't look away despite wanting to, despite knowing that what he was seeing violated every principle of biology and medicine and the basic rules about how injuries worked and how bodies responded to trauma. The torn flesh at the entry and exit points of the wound drew together like fabric being sewn, like time running backward, like causality reversing itself so that injured became uninjured, damaged became whole, bleeding became healed. The muscle tissue knit itself back into coherent structure. The skin pulled closed over the repaired muscle. The blood that had pooled on the sidewalk evaporated into faint mist that dissipated in seconds, leaving no stain, no evidence, no trace that Harold had been injured at all. 15 seconds from impalement to complete healing. No scar, no residual pain based on how Harold stood up and brushed dirt from his pants with casual disregard for the leg that had just been penetrated by an iron spike. No limp, no weakness, no sign that anything extraordinary had occurred except for the small tear in his jeans where the spike had entered, and even that seemed to be repairing itself, fibers pulling together as Ethan watched. Fabric healing, just as the flesh beneath it had healed. "You get used to it," Harold said, noticing Ethan's expression, registering the horror and disbelief and fundamental incomprehension that Ethan couldn't hide despite his attempt to maintain professional composure, to treat this as just another data point in his investigation rather than as a complete dissolution of everything he thought he understood about how reality operated. "That's impossible," Ethan whispered, the words coming out automatic, reflexive. The default response of a rational mind confronting something that couldn't be rationalized, that couldn't be explained, that couldn't be integrated into any framework of understanding that made sense. "Impossible," Harold repeated, and like the waitress had done with inevitable, he seemed to be tasting the word, seemed to be trying to remember what it meant or why anyone would use it to describe something they'd just witnessed with their own eyes. "We used to think so too. But you see enough of it, experience enough of it, and impossible just becomes how things work here, how things have worked for 53 years. Other people had emerged from buildings along Main Street, not running, not showing any urgency or concern about the accident they must have heard, but walking with measured pace, with the same synchronized quality Ethan had noticed in the diner, with movements that seemed slightly too coordinated, slightly too uniform, slightly too perfect to be the natural variation that marked individual human movement. They gathered in a loose circle around Harold and Ethan, watching with expressions that carried no emotion, no curiosity, no investment in the outcome, because presumably they'd seen this before, had witnessed countless injuries and healings and demonstrations that death had become optional in Greywick, that mortality had been suspended or canceled or replaced with some other system for managing the boundary between living and not living. A woman in an apron, probably from the diner, probably Margie, though Ethan couldn't be certain because all the faces were starting to blur together, were starting to lose individual distinctiveness and merge into a collective sameness that went beyond mere family resemblance or small-town genetic similarity into something more fundamental, something that suggested these people weren't just related, but were becoming the same person, were losing whatever uniqueness had once distinguished them from each other. Stepped forward and shook her head with mild disapproval. "Harold, you've got to stop climbing that fence," she said, her tone suggesting this was a recurring problem, suggesting Harold had impaled himself before and would probably do it again, suggesting the injury was more social faux pas than medical emergency. I know, Harold replied, brushing himself off with the embarrassment of someone who'd made a minor mistake in public, rather than someone who'd just survived what should have been a fatal accident. Gate was locked, and I needed to get to the other side. Figured I could make the climb. Figured wrong. "Well, be more careful next time," another voice called from the crowd, and several people laughed. not with the genuine amusement that usually accompanied laughter, but with a hollow sound that seemed performed rather than felt, that seemed like they were going through the motions of what laughter should sound like, without actually experiencing any humor or joy or emotional response that would normally produce laughter. The crowd began to disperse as quickly as it had gathered, people returning to whatever they'd been doing before the accident, returning to their shops and homes, and the mysterious activities that filled their days in a town where death had been eliminated and time had apparently stopped, meaning what it was supposed to mean. Harold waved to Ethan with casual friendliness and headed back toward the Henderson place to presumably finish the hedge trimming he'd been interrupted from completing. And Ethan stood alone on the sidewalk, staring at the spot where blood had pooled minutes ago, where Harold's life should have ended, where impossible had occurred with such casual normalcy that everyone except Ethan treated it as unremarkable. The fog pressed closer, thick enough now that buildings more than 20 feet away faded into gray suggestion, thick enough that Ethan felt isolated despite being in the middle of Main Street, despite knowing that people were nearby in their homes and businesses, despite the visible evidence of human habitation all around him. He felt like he was standing in a bubble of clarity surrounded by infinite gray void. Felt like Greywick was the only real place and everything beyond the fog's boundary had ceased to exist. Felt like he'd driven not into a town, but into some pocket dimension where normal rules didn't apply. And asking why was the wrong question, because why implied causation and logic and reasonable explanation, when what he should be asking was what? What was Greywick? What had it become? What was maintaining this impossible status quo, where injuries healed instantly and death refused to claim anyone, despite 53 years having passed since the last funeral? Ethan pulled out his phone and took photographs of the fence, of the spike that had penetrated Harold's leg, of the sidewalk where blood had pooled and vanished. But when he checked the images on his phone's screen, they showed nothing useful, just normal fence, normal sidewalk, normal afternoon light filtering through normal fog. No blood, no evidence of injury, no visual record of what he'd witnessed, despite the phone's camera being pointed directly at the scene, despite his finger pressing the shutter button, despite the phone producing the familiar artificial shutter sound that confirmed images were being captured. His phone was lying to him, or reality was lying to his phone. Or the distinction between those two possibilities didn't matter, because either way, he had no documentation, no evidence, no way to prove what he'd seen to anyone who wasn't standing here with him when it happened. He needed to find the library. Needed to find historical records, newspaper archives, any documentation that might explain when this started and what had caused it, and whether anyone had attempted to study or understand or escape from whatever had transformed Greywick into a place where immortality was routine and impossible, was just how things worked. The library was 2 blocks north on Main Street, a small brick building with tall windows and a sign above the door that read, Greywick Public Library, founded 1889, in fading letters that suggested the sign hadn't been repainted in decades. That suggested maintenance had become optional or forgotten. That suggested time had different meaning for buildings, just as it had different meaning for people in this town, where nothing seemed to age or decay or progress toward any kind of ending. Ethan climbed the concrete steps to the entrance and pulled open the heavy wooden door, expecting it to creak or resist or show some sign of its apparent age. The door swung smoothly on well-maintained hinges, opened silently, revealed an interior that smelled of old books and dust, and something else underneath those familiar library scents, something metallic and wrong. Something that reminded him of how electrical fires smelled before they became visible flames. Something that suggested corruption or decay, despite the neat rows of shelves and the orderly arrangement of tables and chairs and the general appearance of a well-kept facility. The librarian sat behind a desk near the back, an elderly man with white hair and liver-spotted hands that trembled slightly as he turned pages in a leather-bound ledger, making entries with a fountain pen that scratched across paper with audible pressure, with the particular sound of ink being physically scraped onto a surface, rather than flowing smoothly from nib to page. Ethan Hale, the librarian said without looking up, without any visual confirmation of who had entered, speaking the name with absolute certainty despite having no apparent basis for identification. Ethan froze halfway across the room. "How did you know my name?" The librarian looked up then, and his eyes were cloudy but alert, ancient but aware, carrying knowledge that went beyond whatever information Ethan's appearance might communicate. "We don't get visitors in Greywick," he said simply. "When someone new arrives, the whole town knows. The recorder tells us." "The recorder?" Ethan asked, moving closer to the desk. Drawn by curiosity despite the warning, his instincts were screaming about this man, about this library, about the particular quality of wrongness that seemed concentrated here more intensely than anywhere else in town. The librarian's hands stopped their trembling. His expression shifted from neutral observation to something that might have been fear, or might have been reverence, or might have been both emotions occurring simultaneously. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered. "Journalists are the worst kind of visitor. You ask questions, you investigate, you notice things we've learned to ignore." "I'm here to understand what's happening in this town," Ethan said, trying to sound confident, trying to project journalistic authority despite feeling increasingly uncertain, increasingly out of his depth, increasingly aware that he'd walked into something far stranger and far more dangerous than statistical anomaly or medical mystery. "Understanding won't help you," the librarian said. "Understanding might make it worse. There are things happening in Greywick that are better left unexamined, better left as accepted mystery rather than explained phenomenon. Some explanations create more problems than ignorance ever did." "Tell me anyway," Ethan insisted. "Tell me why no one dies here. Tell me what happened 53 years ago. Tell me what you mean by the recorder." The librarian closed his ledger with slow deliberation, set down his fountain pen with careful precision, folded his hands atop the desk with the formality of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news, to share information that should remain secret but had been asked for directly, and therefore must be provided because some rules demanded honesty, even when honesty was dangerous. 53 years ago, the librarian began, his voice dropping to barely above whisper, something arrived in Greywick, something vast and patient and hungry for a specific kind of sustenance that human beings produce through the simple act of existing. It came from, he paused, searching for words, from somewhere that isn't here. Somewhere that exists alongside our reality, but operates according to different principles, different physics, different rules about what's possible and what's forbidden. "You're describing an alien," Ethan said, "an extraterrestrial entity." "No," the librarian corrected gently. "Aliens would be easier to understand. Aliens would be comprehensible. What came to Greywick isn't alien, it's other. It exists in dimensions we can't perceive directly, influences reality in ways we can only see through effects rather than causes, operates with motivations that don't translate into human concepts like hunger or curiosity or conquest." He leaned forward, his cloudy eyes focusing on Ethan with uncomfortable intensity. "We call it the recorder because that's the closest word we have for what it does. It's preserving us, documenting us, maintaining our continuity with obsessive precision because our deaths would create gaps in its record, would introduce incompleteness into its documentation, would violate whatever purpose or drive or fundamental nature compels it to observe and preserve and prevent any interruption in the story it's collecting." "Story?" Ethan repeated, feeling like he was missing something crucial, feeling like the librarian was speaking in metaphor or allegory, when what Ethan needed was concrete explanation, clear causation, logical progression from A to B to C that would make sense of impossible healing and immortal townspeople and whatever had transformed Greywick into something other than a normal human settlement. "We are characters in a story the recorder is writing," the librarian said, and there was no metaphor in his voice now, no suggestion that he was speaking poetically or symbolically. "Every moment we live, every action we take, every word we speak, it's all being documented, recorded, preserved in whatever medium or format or dimensional structure the recorder uses to maintain its collection. And stories require continuity, require unbroken narrative. require that characters remain present from beginning to end without premature exits, without deaths that would create holes in the plot, without any interruption that would compromise the integrity of the documentation. The lights in the library flickered, not like electrical failure, not with the random pattern of power fluctuation, but with a deliberate rhythm that felt almost like Morse code, like communication, like something was using the electrical system to announce its presence or express its awareness of the conversation occurring beneath its observation. The librarian's face went pale. "It's listening," he whispered. "The recorder knows we're talking about it, knows you're asking questions, and it doesn't like questions because questions introduce uncertainty, introduce the possibility of deviation from expected patterns, introduce chaos into the ordered narrative it's trying to maintain." "Then let it listen," Ethan said, surprising himself with his own boldness, surprising himself with the defiance that surged up despite his growing fear. "I'm not leaving until I understand what's happening here, until I have enough information to write about this, to expose it, to bring outside attention that might help these people escape whatever is keeping them trapped." "You can't expose it," the librarian said sadly. "Your photographs won't show anything unusual. Your recordings won't capture evidence. Your testimony will sound like delusion or fiction, or the desperate imaginings of someone who's lost touch with reality. The recorder controls how it appears to outside observation, maintains the illusion of normalcy, ensures that documentation always shows Greywick as ordinary town with ordinary people living ordinary lives. Only those inside the record can perceive the truth. Only those who've been here long enough to be incorporated into the recorder's collection can see what's really happening. Ethan was about to argue, about to insist that there had to be some way to gather evidence, some method that would allow external verification, when something else occurred to him. "The cemetery," he said. "I saw it when I arrived. All the graves are from 1971 or earlier. That's when it started, isn't it? That's when the recorder arrived and death stopped being possible." The librarian nodded slowly. "July 19th, 1971. That was the day everything changed. That was the day the recorder finished establishing itself in Greywick, finished integrating us into its documentation process, finished implementing whatever mechanisms prevent our deaths and maintain our continuity. Before that day, we were normal. After it," he gestured around the library, around the town beyond, "we became this, became immortal but trapped, became preserved but not living, became characters in a story we didn't choose to be part of." "But there must be a way to break free," Ethan pressed. "Must be some method to escape the recorder's influence, to restore normal mortality, to let people age and die and be released from whatever preservation it's imposed on them." The librarian's expression shifted into something that might have been pity or might have been warning. "There is one way," he admitted. "One day each year when the recorder's hold weakens slightly, when the narrative can be disrupted, when change becomes possible instead of forbidden. July 19th, the anniversary of the recorder's arrival. That's the only day when someone could potentially break the cycle, could potentially free Greywick from the documentation." "Today," Ethan said, realizing with sudden clarity. "Today is July 19th. The librarian nodded. "You arrived on the only day that matters, the only day when the story can change. Whether that's coincidence or whether the recorder itself brought you here as a new element to incorporate into its narrative," he shrugged. "I don't know, but you're here now, and that means you're already becoming part of the record, already being documented, already being preserved whether you want to be or not." Before Ethan could respond, before he could process the implications of what the librarian had just revealed, the library's overhead lights flickered again. Longer this time, more intense, creating a strobe effect that made time seem to skip, made movement appear as series of discontinuous still images rather than smooth progression. And in the gaps between the flashes, in the moments of darkness that separated illuminated instants, Ethan saw something else in the library with them. Not a person, not a physical entity, but a presence, vast and geometric and composed of angles that eyes couldn't quite track, that seemed to exist in more dimensions than three, that looked like it was simultaneously inside and outside the library, simultaneously present and distant, simultaneously solid and transparent. It wasn't looking at them. It was observing them the way scientists observe specimens, the way collectors observe valuable acquisitions, the way archivists observe documents being cataloged and preserved for eternal reference. The recorder, the librarian whispered, his voice shaking. It's manifesting, showing itself because you've noticed it, because awareness creates reciprocal observation, because being seen requires that you acknowledge what's seeing you. The presence pressed closer, not physically, not in any way that could be measured by distance, but conceptually, informationally, existing more intensely in Ethan's awareness with each passing second. He could feel it cataloging him, recording every detail of his appearance and his thoughts and the particular configuration of atoms and consciousness that composed his individual existence. He could feel it integrating him into its documentation, absorbing him into the story it was maintaining, claiming him as another character whose narrative must be preserved unbroken from this moment forward into whatever future the recorder had planned for its collection. The light stabilized. The presence receded, but didn't disappear, didn't release its attention, just pulled back slightly while maintaining constant observation, maintaining constant documentation, maintaining the relentless record-keeping that defined its nature and purpose. You need to leave, the librarian said urgently. Need to run while you still can, while the recorder hasn't finished incorporating you, while you still maintain enough independence to potentially escape beyond Greywick's boundaries and return to the world outside where death is still possible, and stories can end properly instead of being preserved forever in eternal stasis. But Ethan knew with terrible certainty that running wouldn't help. The recorder had seen him, had noticed him, had begun the process of integration that would bind him to Greywick just as completely as it bound everyone else who lived here. He was already part of the story, already being documented, already trapped in the narrative that would preserve him forever, whether he lived in Greywick or tried to flee, whether he cooperated or resisted, whether he accepted his role or fought against the preservation that had already claimed him. The library door opened and Mayor Whitlock entered. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a dark suit that seemed too formal for a small town, carrying himself with the authority of someone who'd learned to navigate the impossible rules governing Greywick's existence. He looked at Ethan with eyes that were simultaneously sympathetic and resigned, with an expression that suggested he'd seen this before, had watched other newcomers discover the truth about the recorder, had guided other people through the transition from visitor to permanent resident, from independent consciousness to documented character. "Mr. Hale," Whitlock said, his voice smooth and practiced, "I've been expecting you. Would you join me in my office? There are things you need to understand about Greywick, about the recorder, about what happens to people who stay too long in a town where stories never end and characters never die." Ethan wanted to refuse, wanted to insist on continuing his conversation with the librarian, wanted to gather more information before subjecting himself to whatever the mayor intended to reveal. But something in Whitlock's expression suggested refusal wasn't really an option, suggested that the invitation was more command than request, suggested that the recorder itself might be directing this encounter, orchestrating this meeting as part of the narrative it was constructing around Ethan's arrival. So he nodded and followed Mayor Whitlock out of the library, followed him down Main Street toward the town hall, followed him deeper into the heart of Greywick, where the recorder's influence was strongest, where the preservation was most complete, where the story the town had become was being written and rewritten in endless iterations that never progressed toward resolution, because resolution required ending, and endings required death, and death was exactly what the recorder existed to prevent. Chapter 2. The Mayor's Confession. The town hall sat at the intersection of Main Street and Cemetery Road, a deliberate architectural choice that Ethan now recognized as darkly appropriate, a physical manifestation of the boundary between life and death that Greywick had learned to navigate, or rather, had learned to deny entirely through whatever mechanism the recorder had imposed on this isolated valley and the 347 people who lived here in permanent suspension, in eternal documentation, in the liminal space between existing and being erased. The building was old brick, 3 stories tall, with narrow windows that reflected the fog-filtered light in ways that made them look less like glass and more like mirrors, showing versions of reality that didn't quite match the observable world, that displayed scenes from slightly different angles or slightly different moments, or slightly different timelines where choices had diverged and outcomes had shifted, and the story the recorder was documenting had taken alternative paths that all somehow led back to this same building, this same moment, this same inevitable conversation between a journalist who'd thought he was investigating an anomaly and a mayor who'd spent 53 years learning to live with impossible truth. Whitlock didn't speak as they climbed the steps to the entrance, didn't offer small talk or pleasantries or any of the social lubrication that normally smoothed interactions between strangers, between people meeting for the first time with different agendas and different levels of understanding about the situation they were navigating together. He simply walked with measured pace, his footsteps creating the only sound besides Ethan's breathing and the distant rustling of wind through pine trees that surrounded the valley, that enclosed Greywick in natural walls that had probably once felt protective but now felt more like prison boundaries, like the edges of a cage that was invisible but absolute, that kept residents contained, not through physical barriers, but through something far more subtle and far more inescapable. The interior of the town hall was dim, despite afternoon light filtering through windows, dim in a way that suggested the darkness wasn't merely absence of illumination, but presence of something else, something that absorbed light rather than simply not reflecting it, something that created shadow, not through obstruction, but through active consumption of the photons that should have been bouncing off surfaces and creating the normal visual landscape of interior architecture. Ethan's eyes struggled to adjust, struggled to resolve details in the murk, struggled to distinguish between walls and doorways, and the spaces where corridors extended into depths that seemed larger than the building's external dimensions could possibly contain. Whitlock led him up a staircase that creaked despite the building's apparent maintenance, despite the polished wood that showed no signs of wear or age, or the accumulated damage that normal foot traffic would create over decades of use. The creaking sounded wrong, not like wood protesting weight, not like materials responding to stress, but like audio recording played at slightly incorrect speed, like sound effect rather than natural acoustic phenomenon, like the building was performing the role of old structure rather than actually being one, was imitating what people expected to hear when climbing stairs in a historic building, rather than producing authentic sounds of wood and nails and aging construction. The mayor's office occupied the second floor, accessible through a heavy oak door that bore a brass nameplate reading Mayor James Whitlock, St. 1971, in letters that had been engraved with either prophetic certainty or retrospective revision, that announced his tenure beginning exactly when the recorder had arrived, exactly when death had stopped being possible, exactly when Greywick had transformed from normal town into documentary subject, into story being preserved, into collection of characters whose narrative must continue unbroken, regardless of natural progression toward conclusion. Whitlock opened the door and gestured for Ethan to enter first, a courtesy that felt more like strategic positioning, felt more like ensuring Ethan was inside before any opportunity for retreat could manifest, felt more like shepherd guiding sheep into pen rather than host welcoming guest into professional space. Ethan entered anyway, entered because curiosity outweighed caution, because journalistic instinct demanded he gather information, even when gathering information might be exactly what the recorder wanted, might be the precise action that would complete his integration into the documentation, might be the choice that would transform him from observer to participant, from investigator to character. The office was surprisingly ordinary: desk, chairs, filing cabinets, bookshelves lined with legal volumes and local history texts, framed photographs on the walls showing Greywick at various points in its past. showing Main Street with different storefronts and different cars and different fashions that marked the progression of decades, despite the building itself and the people in it remaining fundamentally unchanged by the passage of time. Ethan moved closer to examine the photographs, searching for evidence of aging, for signs that residents had grown older between the earlier images and more recent ones, for any indication that normal biological processes had continued even if death had been suspended. But the faces in the photographs remained consistent across decades. The same faces in 1971 and 1980 and 1990 and 2000 and last year, the same appearances without wrinkles or gray hair or any of the accumulated markers that aging imposed on human bodies over time. The people of Greywick had been frozen at whatever age they'd been when the recorder arrived, had been preserved in perfect stasis for 53 years, had lived through more than half a century without adding a single day to their biological age, because aging was apparently another form of progression toward death, another process that the recorder needed to maintain absolute continuity of its documented subjects. They don't age, Ethan said, stating the obvious, because sometimes stating the obvious was the only way to force your mind to accept information it was desperately trying to reject, to make consciousness acknowledge truth that every rational instinct insisted couldn't be true. No, Whitlock confirmed, settling into the chair behind his desk with the weary grace of someone who'd sat in that same chair thousands of times, who'd conducted countless conversations in this office, who'd explained Greywick's impossible reality to how many other visitors over the decades, how many other people who'd noticed the statistical anomaly and come investigating and ended up trapped in the same preservation that had claimed everyone else. We don't age. We don't sicken. We don't deteriorate. Our bodies exist in perfect temporal stasis, maintained at exactly the configuration they held on July 19th, 1971, when the recorder completed its integration and implemented the preservation protocols that would ensure continuity of documentation. Ethan turned away from the photographs and took the chair across from Whitlock's desk, sat down with legs that felt weak, with muscles that trembled from accumulated stress and fear, and the cognitive strain of trying to process impossible information, trying to integrate contradictory data, trying to maintain rational framework when rationality had clearly become an inadequate tool for understanding the reality he now inhabited. The librarian mentioned that today is the anniversary, Ethan said, the one day each year when the recorder's hold weakens and change becomes possible. Yes, Whitlock said, and something in his expression shifted, became more alert, more focused, more present than he'd been during their walk from the library, as if discussing the anniversary activated some dormant aspect of his personality, some suppressed hope or desperate determination that normal days didn't allow him to access. July 19th is unique. It's the day when the recorder's attention divides, when its observation becomes less absolute, when the documentation develops small gaps that might be large enough for someone to exploit, to escape, to break free from the preservation before the gaps close again and normal stasis resumes for another year. So people have tried to escape, Ethan said. On previous anniversaries, people have attempted to leave Greywick, to break free from the recorder's influence. Whitlock's expression darkened. Many have tried. All have failed. The recorder adapts, learns, incorporates escape attempts into its narrative, and ensures those attempts become part of the story it's documenting, rather than disruptions to the story's continuity. Every failed escape strengthens the preservation, teaches the recorder how to prevent future attempts, adds new protocols and safeguards that make the next anniversary even more challenging than the last. He leaned forward, his hands folding on the desk with tension that suggested barely restrained emotion, with pressure that made his knuckles white, with grip that looked like he was holding onto the desk to prevent himself from falling or flying apart or dissolving into the constituent elements that the recorder had bound together into the configuration called James Whitlock. But there's something different about this year, he continued, his voice dropping lower, becoming almost conspiratorial, becoming the tone of someone sharing dangerous secret, of someone risking consequences by speaking truth that should remain unspoken, something unprecedented, something that might actually matter. What's different? Ethan asked, leaning forward to match Whitlock's posture, unconsciously mimicking the mayor's body language in the way humans automatically did when trying to establish rapport, trying to signal cooperation, trying to build the social connection that would encourage information sharing. You, Whitlock said simply. You're what's different. You're the first outsider to arrive in Greywick on July 19th since the recorder established its presence. Every other visitor has come on ordinary days, has been incorporated into the documentation during periods when the recorder's hold is absolute, has been absorbed into the narrative without any possibility of resistance or escape. But you arrived today, on the anniversary, on the one day when the rules are slightly less rigid, when possibilities exist that don't exist on normal days, when someone who understands what's happening might be able to do something that no resident can do because we're already too deeply integrated, already too completely documented, already too thoroughly preserved to act against our own preservation. Ethan felt cold spreading through his chest, felt understanding dawning that brought no comfort, brought only the terrible recognition that he wasn't here by accident, wasn't here by his own choice, despite believing he'd made the decision to investigate Greywick. Wasn't here because of journalistic curiosity, but because of something else, something larger, something that had guided or manipulated or arranged circumstances to ensure he would arrive precisely when he needed to arrive, precisely when his presence might matter, precisely when an outsider's actions could potentially disrupt the documentation in ways that residents couldn't achieve, no matter how desperately they tried. The recorder brought me here, Ethan said, understanding crystallizing into words, implications spreading through his consciousness like fractures spreading through stressed glass. It wanted me to arrive today, wanted a new element in its narrative, wanted someone who could potentially escape because the possibility of escape makes the story more interesting, more complex, more worth documenting than endless stasis where nothing ever changes and no one ever leaves. Perhaps, Whitlock allowed, or perhaps the universe itself is fighting back against the recorder's preservation, is trying to introduce chaos into the ordered narrative, is attempting to create opportunities for disruption that might free us from documentation. I don't know which explanation is correct. Don't know if anyone could know, because knowing would require understanding the recorder's true nature and motivations, would require comprehending something that exists partially outside our dimensional framework, that operates according to principles we can barely perceive, let alone analyze or predict. He opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a leather-bound journal, old and worn, pages yellowed with age, despite the preservation that should have kept it pristine, despite the temporal stasis that should have prevented decay of any kind within Greywick's boundaries. He placed the journal on the desk between them, positioned it precisely in the center, oriented it so the spine faced Ethan with deliberate care. "This is the shadow ledger," Whitlock said, and his voice carried reverence or fear or both emotions blended into single complex response to the object he just revealed. The complete record of everyone who's lived in Greywick since 1971. Every resident, every visitor, every person who's spent more than 24 hours within the valley's boundaries. The recorder maintains its own documentation, but we maintain this ledger because we need to remember, need to preserve our own record parallel to whatever the recorder is preserving, need to have evidence that can't be altered or erased or revised by the entity that controls our existence. Ethan reached for the journal with hands that weren't quite steady, with fingers that wanted to recoil from the leather cover, because touching it felt like accepting something, like agreeing to terms he didn't understand, like participating in ritual whose meaning exceeded simple information gathering and crossed into territory where actions had metaphysical consequences, where choices created bonds that couldn't be broken just by changing your mind afterward. But he needed to know, needed to see what the ledger contained, needed to understand the full scope of what was happening in Greywick before he could make informed decisions about what to do next, about whether escape was possible or advisable, about whether he should try to flee before the recorder completed his integration, or whether staying and attempting to understand might serve some larger purpose that he couldn't yet perceive. He opened the ledger to the first page and saw names written in careful script, saw dates of arrival and brief descriptions of circumstances that had brought each person to Greywick, saw notations about their status, resident or visitor or integrated or absorbed, using terms that carried meanings Ethan could only guess at, that suggested different categories of relationship with the recorder, different levels of incorporation into the documentation, different degrees of preservation and loss of autonomy. The entries began on July 19, 1971, with a list of 347 names, the original population, the people who'd been living in Greywick when the recorder arrived, the residents who'd become the foundation of the documentation, the characters around whom the story would be constructed and maintained for the next 53 years. Brief descriptions followed each name: ages, occupations, family relationships, the ordinary biographical details that defined human lives and distinguished individuals from each other, before those distinctions began eroding under the recorder's preservation, before individual identity started blurring into collective existence, before the town's residents started becoming variations of the same documented subject rather than truly separate people. Ethan flipped forward through pages chronicling the first years after the recorder's arrival, chronicling the gradual realization that something fundamental had changed, that death had stopped occurring, that injuries healed instantly, that aging had ceased, that time continued passing, but biological processes had frozen at whatever state they'd occupied when preservation protocols activated. The handwriting changed as different people contributed to the ledger over the years, as responsibility for maintaining the record passed from one resident to another, as decades accumulated and the documentation grew to include not just the original population, but also the visitors who'd arrived and stayed too long and become permanent additions to Greywick's trapped community. And then Ethan saw a name that made his heart stutter, made his breath catch, made reality tilt beneath him as if the floor had suddenly become uncertain about maintaining horizontal orientation. Martha Hale arrived, July 15, 1973, status visitor, integrated. Notes: journalist investigating death statistics, stayed 7 days, could not leave, currently working at library, no memory of life before Greywick, integration complete. Martha Hale, his grandmother. The woman who'd disappeared when his father was 15 years old, who'd left for an assignment and never returned, who'd become a family mystery that no investigation had ever solved, because there was no body to find, no evidence of foul play, no explanation for how someone could vanish so completely that 50 years of searching had produced nothing except endless questions and the slow erosion of hope that she might still be alive somewhere, might someday be found, might someday come home and explain where she'd been and why she'd stayed away. She hadn't disappeared. She'd come to Greywick, had arrived 2 years after the recorder established its presence, had arrived investigating the same statistical anomaly that had brought Ethan here, had stayed too long and become integrated, had been absorbed into the documentation so completely that her memory of her previous life had been erased, had been replaced by whatever false history the recorder had constructed to explain her presence and maintain narrative coherence. "You knew," Ethan said, his voice barely functioning, choked by emotion that was part grief and part rage and part terrible understanding. "You knew my grandmother was here. You knew who I was when I arrived. You've been expecting me because family comes looking for family, because patterns repeat, because the recorder probably arranged for me to learn about Greywick's anomaly the same way it arranged for her to learn about it 51 years ago." Whitlock didn't deny it. "I recognized your name when the recorder informed us you were coming. Recognized the family connection, suspected you might be Martha's grandson or great-grandson, depending on generational timing. The recorder likes these symmetries, these repetitions, these echoes that create pattern and structure in the narrative it's documenting. It brought your grandmother here to study us. Now it's brought you to study what happened to her." The story continues. The documentation expands. New chapters begin that mirror and reflect earlier chapters in ways that create coherent narrative arc. "Where is she?" Ethan demanded. "Where's my grandmother?" "The library," Whitlock said quietly. "She works there now, has worked there since her integration completed 30 years ago. She doesn't remember you, doesn't remember her life before Greywick, doesn't remember her son or her husband or any of the history that defined her before the recorder erased those memories and replaced them with fabricated past that serves the documentation's needs better than authentic history would have served." Ethan stood abruptly, chair scraping backward, his body responding before conscious thought could moderate the response. He needed to see her, needed to confirm this impossible claim, needed to look into the eyes of the woman who disappeared from his father's life and determine whether anything of his grandmother remained inside the documented character the recorder had created, whether some spark of authentic identity persisted beneath the preservation, whether recognition might break through the erasure and restore memories the recorder had supposedly destroyed. "Seeing her won't help," Whitlock said, but he didn't try to stop Ethan, didn't attempt to prevent him from leaving the office, didn't block the door or insist they finish their conversation before Ethan charged off on what might be futile quest to connect with someone who no longer existed as the person she'd been, who'd been transformed into someone else, who'd been rewritten to serve the recorder's narrative purposes. Ethan ignored the warning and ran back down the creaking stairs that performed their audio simulation of old wood, ran through the dim corridors that consumed light and created shadow through active darkness rather than passive absence of illumination, ran out into the fog-thick streets where afternoon was transitioning to evening without clear demarcation between the two states, without definite boundary marking when day ended and night began. Because time itself was negotiable in Greywick, was more suggestion than absolute measurement, was maintained only because humans expected temporal progression, and the recorder needed to preserve enough normalcy to keep its characters functioning within parameters that resembled ordinary existence. The library was 2 blocks away, but felt farther when running, felt like distance was expanding to slow his progress, felt like the town itself was creating obstacles that weren't physically present, but that made movement more difficult, made navigation more challenging, made the simple act of traveling from one location to another into task that required excessive effort and excessive time and excessive determination to complete. But he reached the library, burst through the door without ceremony or caution, called out, "Martha Hale," with voice that echoed too loudly in the quiet interior, that reverberated off walls and shelves and the high ceiling in ways that made the name repeat and overlap and create harmonics that sounded like multiple people speaking simultaneously, like chorus of voices rather than single shout. The elderly librarian he'd spoken to earlier emerged from between shelves, moving with the careful steps of someone navigating familiar territory, moving with confidence that suggested he knew every inch of the library's layout, that he could navigate blindfolded through aisles and around obstacles and directly to any volume in the collection. But when he saw Ethan, when he registered the expression on Ethan's face and the desperation in his posture and the wild energy that accompanied people who just learned terrible truth and were trying to process implications that exceeded their capacity for immediate comprehension, the librarian's own expression shifted into something that looked like sympathy, mixed with resignation, mixed with the particular sadness that came from watching someone discover what you'd already known for years, from witnessing another person's innocence dying exactly as your own innocence had died decades earlier. "You found your name in the ledger," the librarian said. Not a question, a statement of fact based on observation of Ethan's state, based on recognition of emotional trajectory that the librarian had presumably witnessed before, had seen in other visitors who'd discovered their own connections to Greywick, who'd learned that family members had disappeared here, had realized that the statistical anomaly they'd come to investigate was actually personal tragedy affecting their own bloodline. "Not my name," Ethan said, his voice raw. "My grandmother's name. Martha Hale. The ledger says she works here. Says she's been here since 1973. Says she doesn't remember her life before Greywick. The librarian's cloudy eyes focused on Ethan with sharp attention that contradicted their apparent blindness, with clarity that suggested those eyes saw more than just physical appearance, that perceived something deeper or truer or more essential than surface details. "Martha," he said softly, and the way he spoke the name carried familiarity, carried decades of daily interaction, carried the comfortable intimacy of people who'd worked together for years. "You're looking for Martha." "Yes," Ethan said desperately. "Where is she? I need to see her. Need to talk to her. Need to know if there's anything left of who she was before the recorder changed her." The librarian gestured toward the back of the library, toward a door marked Archives, in faded letters that had probably been painted decades ago and never refreshed, that had been allowed to deteriorate despite the preservation that should have maintained everything in perfect stasis. "She's in the basement," the librarian said, "working on the historical records, organizing documentation that predates the recorder's arrival. She spends most of her time down there now. Says she feels more comfortable with the old documents than with the new ones. Says the past feels more real than the present." Ethan moved toward the archives door without thanking the librarian, without acknowledging the guidance, moving on autopilot while his conscious mind was elsewhere, was preparing for confrontation with ghost, with person who should be dead but wasn't, with grandmother he'd never met because she'd disappeared 20 years before he was born, but whose absence had shaped his father's life and therefore shaped his own life in ways he'd never fully acknowledged until this moment when the abstract concept of missing grandmother became concrete possibility of actual person existing in the basement of this library, in this impossible town where death refused to occur, and the recorder documented everything for purposes Ethan still didn't fully understand. The basement stairs descended into darkness that wasn't alleviated by the single bare bulb hanging at the bottom, that persisted despite illumination, that maintained itself as active presence rather than passive absence of light. The air grew colder as he descended, grew heavier, grew thicker with that metallic smell he'd noticed earlier, that smell of corruption or electrical fire or something wrong happening in spaces where wrongness shouldn't be possible. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened into a large room lined with filing cabinets and shelves and boxes containing decades or centuries of accumulated documents, of preserved records, of historical artifacts that towns collected and stored because someone thought they might be important someday, might be valuable to future researchers, might contain information worth preserving, even though most of it would never be examined again after initial filing. And in the center of the room, sitting at a small table with stacks of yellowed papers arranged in neat piles, sat a woman in her 60s, or rather, a woman who appeared to be in her 60s despite chronological age that should have made her 90-something, despite biological reality that should have aged her 3 additional decades beyond the age she'd been when the recorder froze her in temporal stasis on whatever date her integration had completed and her preservation had become absolute. She looked up when Ethan reached the bottom of the stairs, looked up with eyes that were clear and alert but carried no recognition, no response to his presence beyond the mild curiosity any person might direct toward unexpected visitor interrupting their work. She looked exactly like the photograph his father had kept on his desk for 40 years, exactly like the woman whose disappearance had created hole in his father's life that nothing had ever filled, exactly like the grandmother Ethan had seen in old family albums but had never actually met because she'd been gone before he existed. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice pleasant and professional, carrying no emotional weight, no suggestion that this moment mattered more than any other interaction she'd had with any other visitor to the archives. "Martha Hale," Ethan said, his voice breaking on her name, emotion overwhelming his attempt to maintain composure, to approach this rationally, to treat this as journalism rather than as deeply personal encounter with family member who'd been erased. She smiled politely. "Yes, that's my name. Are you researching local history? I maintain the archives here. Can help you find documentation on most topics related to Greywick's past, though our records become less complete the farther back you go. Things before 1889 are fragmentary at best. Do you remember Chicago? Ethan asked desperately. Do you remember working as a journalist? Do you remember your husband David, your son Thomas? Do you remember the life you had before you came here? Her expression shifted, not to recognition, not to sudden recovery of suppressed memories, but to confusion mixed with concern, to the particular look people directed toward someone who might be mentally ill or dangerously unstable, to the social response humans produced when encountering behavior that deviated too far from normal parameters and suggested potential threat. I don't know what you're talking about, she said carefully, maintaining calm tone despite obvious nervousness. I've lived in Greywick my entire life. I've never been to Chicago. I'm not married. I don't have children. I think perhaps you've confused me with someone else. No, Ethan insisted, moving closer to her table, close enough to see the fine details of her face, to confirm that this was definitely his grandmother, despite her claim to be someone else, to know with absolute certainty that the recorder had erased her authentic history and replaced it with fabricated past. You're Martha Hale from Chicago. You disappeared in 1973 while investigating Greywick's death statistics. You had a husband and a son who've spent 50 years wondering what happened to you, who never stopped looking, who never accepted that you were gone forever. She stood abruptly, backing away from the table, backing away from Ethan with expression that had shifted from confusion to fear, with body language that suggested she was preparing to run or call for help or do whatever she thought necessary to protect herself from the stranger who'd invaded her workspace and was making claims that contradicted everything she believed about her own identity and history. I don't know who you think I am, she said, voice rising slightly, but you're wrong. You need to leave. You need to. The lights went out, not flickering, not gradual dimming, but instant transition from illuminated to absolute darkness that was so complete, Ethan couldn't see his hand when he held it inches from his face. Couldn't see any detail of the basement or the woman who'd been standing 5 feet away. Couldn't perceive anything except the darkness itself, which wasn't merely absence of light, but presence of something that consumed light, that devoured illumination, that created void where sight couldn't function, regardless of how many photons were theoretically present. And in that darkness, something moved. Not Martha, not Ethan. Something else. Something vast that shouldn't have been able to fit in the basement, that shouldn't have been able to exist in three-dimensional space at all, that occupied the room in ways that violated geometry and physics and the basic principles of how objects related to the space they inhabited. The recorder had manifested, was showing itself because Ethan had pushed too hard, had tried to break through the erasure, had attempted to restore memories that the recorder needed to remain suppressed because authentic memory would compromise the narrative coherence, would introduce contradictions into the documentation, would create problems that preservation protocols couldn't accommodate without fundamentally restructuring the entire record of Martha Hale's existence within Greywick's boundaries. Ethan felt it observing him, not with eyes, not with sensory organs of any recognizable kind, but with attention that was purely informational, purely archival, purely about cataloging and documenting and adding his presence to the massive database of recorded existence that the recorder maintained with obsessive completeness. He felt it measuring him, analyzing him, determining where he fit into the narrative structure, deciding what role he should play in the story, assigning him a character type and plot function and dramatic purpose that would serve the documentation's needs. And he felt it changing him, felt his memories becoming less certain, less vivid, less reliably his own, felt his history being examined and evaluated and potentially edited to better serve narrative purposes, felt his identity becoming negotiable, becoming optional, becoming just another element the recorder could adjust or revise or replace entirely if such changes would improve the story's coherence or dramatic impact. No, Ethan said into the darkness, said with determination he didn't feel, said because resistance seemed important, even if resistance was futile, even if the recorder was too vast and too powerful and too fundamentally other for human opposition to matter. I remember who I am. I remember why I came here. I remember my grandmother and my father and the life I had before arriving in Greywick. You can't erase that. You can't rewrite my past to serve your documentation." The darkness pressed closer, pressed against his skin like physical substance, like pressure that compressed him, that tried to compact his consciousness into smaller space, into more manageable form, into simpler configuration that would be easier to document and preserve and incorporate into the existing narrative structure. And then light returned. Not the basement's bare bulb, not normal illumination, but strange phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the documents stored in filing cabinets, from the very air that filled the space. And in that unnatural light, Ethan saw his grandmother again. But she'd changed. Her face was the same, her body the same, her appearance unchanged in any physical detail. But her eyes were different, were looking at him with recognition now, with terrible understanding, with the expression of someone who just remembered everything they'd forgotten, who just recovered memories the recorder had suppressed for 30 years, who'd just become fully themselves again after decades of being someone else, someone fabricated, someone who'd never really existed except as role in a story. "Thomas," she whispered, using his father's name, seeing resemblance between Ethan and her son, recognizing family features despite never having seen Ethan before. "You look like Thomas. You're his son, aren't you? You're my grandson." "Yes," Ethan said, tears streaming down his face without permission, without conscious decision to cry, his body responding to emotion that exceeded his capacity to process rationally. "I'm Ethan, Thomas's son, your grandson. I came here looking for answers about Greywick, and I found you instead." Martha moved toward him with steps that looked painful, looked like walking through molasses or deep water, or resistance that shouldn't exist in normal air. The recorder was fighting her movement, was trying to reassert control, was attempting to reimpose the erasure that had maintained her false identity for 3 decades. But something about Ethan's presence, something about the anniversary, something about this particular moment had weakened the recorder's hold enough for authentic memory to break through, for suppressed identity to resurface, for Martha Hale from Chicago to exist again, even if only temporarily, before the recorder reimposed its documentation and erased her authentic self once more. She reached him and grabbed his arms with hands that trembled, with grip that felt desperate, with touch that conveyed decades of loss and isolation and imprisonment in roles she'd never chosen, in life she'd never wanted, in story that wasn't hers, but that the recorder had forced her to inhabit for purposes she still didn't understand. "You have to leave," she said urgently. "Have to escape before the day ends, before the anniversary passes, before the recorder completes your integration the way it completed mine. I can't leave. I've been here too long, been documented too thoroughly, been preserved too completely. But you still have chance. You're still new enough that escape might be possible, still separate enough that the recorder hasn't finished incorporating you into the narrative." "I'm not leaving without you," Ethan said stubbornly. "Not leaving my grandmother trapped here when I just found her." "You have to," Martha insisted. "Because if you stay, if you become like me, then my son loses his mother and his son both. Then Thomas loses everything. Then the family I left behind loses twice because I came here and couldn't escape, and now you've come here and you're making the same mistake." The phosphorescent glow began to fade, the basement's darkness reasserting itself. The recorder's attention focusing more intensely, pressing down harder, reimposing control that Martha's temporary recovery had disrupted. Ethan could see her expression beginning to change, could see recognition fading from her eyes, could see authentic identity being erased again as the recorder restored its preferred documentation, its constructed history, its narrative that required Martha to be someone who'd always lived in Greywick, rather than someone who'd arrived from elsewhere and been forcibly integrated against her will. "Remember me," Martha said, her voice already becoming less urgent, less emotional, less her authentic self, and more the character the recorder had created. "Remember that I'm here. Remember what happened to me. And if you escape, when you escape, tell Thomas I'm sorry. Tell him I tried to come home. Tell him the town wouldn't let me leave." And then she was gone. Not physically. Her body remained standing in front of him, remained present in the basement, remained visible in the returning darkness. But the person inhabiting that body had been erased again, had been replaced by the constructed identity, had become the Martha who believed she'd always lived in Greywick, and had no memory of Chicago or David or Thomas or the life she'd actually lived before the recorder had claimed her. She blinked at Ethan with polite confusion. "I'm sorry," she said in that pleasant professional tone that carried no emotional weight. "I don't remember what we were discussing. Did you need help finding something in the archives?" Ethan couldn't speak, couldn't respond, could only stare at the grandmother he'd finally met and immediately lost again, could only watch her return to being someone else, could only bear witness to the erasure that the recorder had just performed right in front of him to demonstrate its power, to show him what would happen if he stayed too long, to make absolutely clear what his future would be if he failed to escape before the anniversary ended and the recorder's hold returned to full strength. He turned and ran back up the basement stairs, ran past the elderly librarian who watched him go with that same sad, knowing expression, ran out into the foggy streets where evening was definitely night now, where darkness was complete, where the only illumination came from streetlights that burned with that same strange quality he'd noticed earlier, that created light that somehow failed to actually illuminate anything properly, that produced visibility that was incomplete and uncertain and deeply wrong. And as he ran, Ethan felt the town watching him, felt the recorder's attention tracking his movement, felt the documentation continuing, the preservation tightening, the narrative incorporating his desperate flight into its structure as just another scene in the story, just another dramatic moment that would be preserved forever in whatever format the recorder maintained, whatever archive it was constructing from the lives of 347 people and everyone who'd ever visited Greywick since July 19th, 1971. He was running out of time. The anniversary would end at midnight. And when it ended, the recorder's weakened hold would restore itself to full strength. And anyone still in Greywick when that happened would be trapped forever, would become permanent character in the